In every ancient culture, there is at least one story of a giant race that eventually morphed into present-day humans. For centuries, we've been told that giants were myth, folklore, and stories to scare children around campfires. But there is a problem with this narrative. Every ancient civilization on Earth described giants. The Hebrews wrote about them. The Greeks built temples to them. The Sumerians even claimed they created us while Native Americans hunted them down. And worst of all, the Norse feared their return. But behind every giant story, there's something nobody tells you. These different cultures weren't describing the same class of giants. For example, the Nephilim had 6 fingers and supernatural strength, whereas the Titans could trigger earthquakes with their footsteps. The Anunnaki descended from the sky in flying machines, and the red-haired Ka. They were cannibals trapped in a cave and burned alive. These different giants weren't variations of the same legend. They were entirely different species with different origins, abilities, and fates. So today, we're doing something that's never been done before. We're breaking down every single giant type that walked this earth, from the biblical hybrids to the scientific anomalies, and from the geological monsters to the extraterrestrial engineers. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what made each giant type unique and why they all disappeared. Starting with the well-known Nephilim, the hybrid giants. In 1928, archaeologist Julio Tello made a discovery in the Paracas Peninsula, Peru, that would puzzle scientists for decades. Inside ancient tombs, Tello found over 300 skulls that looked far from ordinary human skulls. They were elongated, massive in size, with cranial volumes 25% larger than normal human heads. However, people were still skeptical. What if they belonged to random humans from way back? Until a DNA analysis was finally conducted in 2014. The results from the skulls showed genetic markers that didn't match any known human population. These Paracas skulls had only 2 cranial plates instead of the normal 3, with significantly larger eye sockets and nasal cavities. But do you know what makes this discovery even stranger? These same weird physical characteristics appear in texts written thousands of years earlier, texts describing beings called the Nephilim. Now, who are the Nephilim? For a start, let's visit biblical texts. According to Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim were the offspring of an unholy union. Back then, the sons of God, or better put, the angels sent to earth, mated with human women, producing hybrid children known as the Nephilim, which translates to fallen ones. The Book of Enoch, written around the 4th century BCE, dramatically expands this story, especially because it describes 200 angels called the Watchers who descended to earth, led by Samyaza and Azazel, and took human wives for themselves. There is more drama. Not only did these angels just mate with women, but they also taught forbidden knowledge to the same humans they were meant to watch over. In no time, their offspring became something the world had never seen before. This brings us to the question, what did the Nephilim look like? For starters, their height was their signature, but the Nephilim weren't just tall. They were giants, standing between 12 and 18 feet in height. These are the same giants that the Israelite spies saw in Canaan and reported feeling like grasshoppers in comparison. But their size wasn't the only thing that set them apart. Multiple ancient sources describe them as giants with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. 2 Samuel 21:20 explicitly mentions a giant warrior at Gath who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. Can you believe this? If you don't, there are more pointers. Archaeological evidence supports this description too. At Chaco culture sites in the American Southwest, researchers found 6-fingered handprints and footprints impressed into ancient plaster walls. Then there are the elongated, almost alien-looking skulls. Some accounts even mention double rows of teeth, giving them a predatory, inhuman look. These weren't mutations. These were the features of a hybrid species that was never meant to exist. It was human DNA being corrupted by something from beyond, and in no time, this corruption bore fruit. Beyond the Nephilim's interesting story and physically imposing structure, their abilities also set them apart from anything purely human. According to ancient texts, the Nephilim possessed superhuman strength that allowed them to overpower angels themselves, move objects multiple times their weight, and crush stone with their bare hands. But this power of theirs wasn't limited to brute force. There were rumors of more telepathic abilities. That's right. The unimaginable capacity to read minds, project thoughts, and even manipulate the behavior of others, all because they were an unholy offspring. Some accounts cross the line to suggest that the most advanced Nephilim could perceive reality itself differently if they wanted to. The Book of Enoch goes further. It claims the Watchers taught their hybrid children strange things, like metallurgy for weapons, astrology for predicting the future, and genetic manipulation, the very science that created them. Unbelievable. To absorb this, we need solid proof. So where's the proof? It starts with those Paracas skulls in Peru. Remember, they had only 2 cranial plates instead of 3, with cranial volumes 25% larger than modern humans. Plus, DNA testing showed genetic markers that don't match any known human population. What could be the explanation behind that? Secondly, there's the 6-fingered evidence. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, researchers discovered 6-fingered and 6-toed handprints and footprints permanently impressed into ancient plaster walls. And these weren't art, they were real. In addition to these pointers, archaeological reports from the 1800s and early 1900s documented discoveries of oversized bones and weaponry. We are talking about artifacts so massive that only giants could have wielded them. But mysteriously, many of these artifacts disappeared, sent to institutions like the Smithsonian, and never seen again. What role did the Nephilim play in the ancient world? According to Genesis, they became the mighty men of old, men of renown. That is, they were warlords, or to put simply, the ruling class before the flood. And for good reason too. Their superior strength and knowledge gave them total dominance over normal humans. Because of this ruling class power, they built kingdoms and enslaved populations. And according to the Book of Enoch, they eventually turned to cannibalism when conventional food sources couldn't sustain their massive appetites. This was the corruption that the Nephilim plagued the earth with, the reason why they had to be wiped away. So, what happened to them? According to both the Book of Jubilees and Genesis, one of God's primary purposes for the flood was to rid the earth of the Nephilim, to cleanse creation of this genetic abomination. Also, 2 Peter 2:5 confirms that all the ungodly were wiped out in Noah's flood, and Genesis 7 states that all humanity and creatures associated with humanity, except those on the ark, were killed. This, right here, is how the Nephilim were unalived in the Great Flood. But there is a loophole here. Numbers 13:33 mentions Nephilim again after the flood, when the Israelite spies reported seeing them in Canaan. Were these new hybrids, descendants who somehow survived? Or were the spies exaggerating out of fear? This brings us to the next ancient giant type, Rephaim, the ghost giants. It is widely known that the Nephilim died in the flood, with every last one of them drowned when the waters covered the earth. But did they truly go extinct from there? Because hundreds of years later, when the biblical Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan to scout the promised land, 10 of them came back terrified, and this is why. In the land of Canaan, the spies reported seeing giants, and these were not just any giants. From how they looked, they were connected to the Nephilim. But that's impossible. The great flood wiped them all out from earth. So what were the spies actually seeing? The answer lies in a giant race called the Rephaim. The name itself means shades or departed spirits, and this dual meaning of the Hebrew word tells you everything you need to know about them, starting with the timeline of their existence. The Rephaim were post-flood giants. Most biblical scholars believe they were descendants of a second forbidden union between fallen angels and human women after the flood. That is, the original transgression was repeated in a smaller way. Then others suggest that the Rephaim carried corrupted Nephilim genetics that somehow survived through Noah's daughters-in-law. Either way, the Rephaim quickly became the most widespread giant race in Canaan. They occupied territories east of the Jordan River, particularly in Bashan and the surrounding regions. The book of Deuteronomy goes further to list them among the tribes that existed before the Israelites arrived. And among the Rephaim, there's the most famous one. He was known as King Og of Bashan, and he was popular for this reason. His iron bed alone measured 13.5 feet long. That wasn't decor just because he was a king. That was a piece of furniture that put King Og's height into perspective. If this one famous Rephaim was so tall, what did the Rephaim look like? Unlike the Nephilim, who were described as robust and powerful, the Rephaim had a different look entirely. They stood between 10 and 13 feet tall, slightly shorter than their Nephilim predecessors. But beyond their height, their appearance was what truly made people afraid. Ancient texts described them with pale, almost translucent skin. Some accounts use the word shades, not just to reference the dead, but to describe their actual complexion, as if you could see through them in certain light. The Rephaim had gaunt, skeletal faces, sunken eyes, and long limbs that looked too thin to support their massive frames. Where the Nephilim looked like warriors, the Rephaim looked like corpses that refused to meet their maker. This is why the Hebrew word for them became synonymous with the spirits of the dead dwelling in Sheol. They looked like walking ghosts, so much so that the very sight of them was enough to make grown men feel like grasshoppers. However, the Rephaim weren't just terrifying to look at. They had a connection to something darker. The Hebrew word Rephaim doesn't only mean giants. It's the word used throughout Scripture for the spirits of the dead dwelling in Sheol, the underworld. This wasn't a coincidence. The Rephaim existed in both worlds simultaneously, living giants who somehow bridged the gap between the land of the living and the realm of death. Hard to believe. But ancient texts describe them as having abilities tied to the underworld itself. If you wonder if there is any sense in this, there is evidence. To this day, the Valley of Rephaim near Jerusalem bears their name. This strategic valley just southwest of the city became a battlefield where the biblical David's armies repeatedly clashed with Philistine forces who employed Rephaim warriors. Then there's Og of Bashan. Deuteronomy 3:11 specifically states his iron bed measured 9 cubits long. That's over 13 feet. This wasn't a throne, but a bed built to a functional scale for a giant king. And do you remember the infamous Goliath? The 9.5-foot champion from Gath who terrorized Israel? He wasn't just a freak of nature. 2 Samuel 21 identifies him as one of the Rephaim, who came from a lineage of giants, all connected to the Valley of Rephaim and the post-flood giant races. Moving on, let's talk about the role played by this giant type. The Rephaim served as elite mercenaries. The Philistines employed them simply because they were terrifying. Imagine facing a 12-foot warrior who looked like a walking corpse, wielding weapons normal men couldn't even lift. Your first cue would definitely be to run away. But they were more than soldiers. Archaeological evidence, such as the Ugarit, states that the Rephaim led death cults, performing rituals to ancestral spirits and treating the boundary between life and death as something they could manipulate. Still, even with this special power, they were removed from Earth's surface. How so? The Israelites hunted them systematically. To take over the Promised Land, Joshua's conquest targeted their strongholds. David's mighty men finished the job, ending the last known Rephaim warriors one by one. By the end of David's reign, they were extinct. The ghost giants finally joined the actual ghosts in Sheol. Anakim, the neck giants. The Rephaim were terrifying, yes, we all agree. But unfortunately, they weren't the only post-flood giants terrorizing Canaan. When Moses' 12 spies finally reached Hebron, they didn't just see Rephaim. They saw another race. A race so dominant that their name became synonymous with the giants themselves. They were called the Anakim. This name stems from the fascinating Hebrew word Anak. Fascinating because it's a homophone, that is, it sounds identical to the Hebrew words for both giant and necklace. But there is a deeper meaning. The root word actually translates to long neck. Now, when ancient people saw someone exceptionally tall, the first thing they noticed wasn't just their height, it was their neck. A 12-foot tall person gives the immediate impression of an impossibly long neck stretching upward. This is how the Anakim became known as the long-necked ones, also known as the neck giants. A giant called Anak was the forefather of this race. His 3 sons, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, occupied Hebron and became the terror of southern Canaan. Biblical scholars believe the Anakim were either a subgroup of the Rephaim or descended from the same post-flood forbidden union that created them. Either way, they stood between an illegal 9 to 12 feet tall, slightly shorter than the Nephilim, but still massive enough to make grown warriors feel like children. But here's what separated the Anakim from other giant races. Beyond warriors, they were master builders. And to date, Hebron still bears the evidence. During excavations in the 1960s and 1980s, archaeologists uncovered something interesting beneath the modern city. A massive cyclopean wall constructed from enormous polygonal stones, fitted together without mortar. The wall stood nearly 15 feet high in places and was almost 12 feet thick. The crazy part is, this same construction style appears at other Anakim sites throughout Canaan, like Jerusalem's Spring Tower and Shechem. But despite their intimidating size and building prowess, the Anakim still fell. How did this happen? For 40 years, the Anakim's reputation kept Israel out of the Promised Land. An entire generation died in the wilderness because they refused to face these giants. But then Joshua and Caleb came along. the two spies who were not afraid of the monstrous giants. Under Joshua's lead, the Israelites defeated the Anakim strongholds. From Hebron to Debir to Anab, they drove them from the hill country until only scattered remnants remained in the Philistine cities. And then Caleb, at 85 years old, personally drove out the three sons of Anak from Hebron. The very giants that had terrified 10 spies 4 decades earlier were defeated by a single faithful man in his old age. The Anakim were broken. Their bloodline survived only in the Philistine territories, where centuries later, one of their descendants would face a shepherd boy named David. His name was Goliath. Emim and Zamzummim, the terror giants. But the Anakim weren't the only giants defending Canaan's borders. In the east of the Jordan River, in the territories of Moab and Ammon, 2 terrifying giant races held dominion, the Emim and the Zamzummim. The Emim occupied the land of Moab, and their name tells you everything you need to know about them. Emim comes from the Hebrew word meaning terrors, or objects of terror. This giant race wasn't called terrors because they were scary looking. Instead, it was because of what they did. Standing between 10 and 14 feet tall, the Emim were as tall as the Anakim, and just as much. But unlike the Anakim, who built cities and employed strategy, the Emim relied on something more primal: psychological warfare. That's right. Ancient accounts describe them as extremely aggressive. They didn't just defend their territory, but they also actively hunted anyone who came near. With such a reputation, enemies stayed away for generations. But just north of the Emim, in the land of Ammon, lived the Zamzummim, and their name is even stranger. Zamzummim comes from the Hebrew word zimzum, which means buzz or hum. When the Ammonites heard these giants speak, their language sounded like buzzing, like the droning of massive insects. The Ammonites literally named them after the sound they made. But there's a far darker interpretation. The word zimzum was also associated with the sounds that spirits of the dead made, the chirping and muttering of mediums communicating with Sheol. So when you think about it, were the Zamzummim named for their strange language or for their connection to death itself? Regardless of the goosebumps-inducing names, both the Emim and Zamzummim understood something fundamental about warfare. You don't need to fight if your enemy is too terrified to engage. So they created buffer zones around their territories. Any enemy approaching would hear stories and see evidence of their brutality. That way, they turned back before ever encountering the giants directly. As for where these giant types came from, the biblical book Deuteronomy 2:10-11 and 2:20-21 confirms that they were part of the Rephaim. Like their cousins, they were post-flood giants descended from the same corrupted bloodline. But here's what's interesting. The Emim and Zamzummim weren't defeated by Israel. These giants were destroyed by the Moabites and Ammonites. Deuteronomy explicitly states that God helped Lot's descendants, who were normal-sized humans, to drive out and destroy these giant races before Israel arrived. How did regular people defeat 14-foot terror giants? The same way David would later defeat Goliath. Divine intervention. By the time Moses led Israel through the region, the Emim and Zamzummim were already extinct. Only their names remained. Titans, the geological giants. But from here, we leave the biblical world behind, because the giants weren't just found in Canaan. Across the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks told stories of beings even more massive. Beings who didn't just walk the earth, they were literally part of it. And it's no other giant race than the Titans. Now, where did the infamous Titans come from? According to Hesiod's Theogony, written in the 8th century BCE, the Titans came from the union of two primordial forces, Gaia, the earth herself, and Uranus, the personification of the sky. This union led to the birth of the 12 original Titans: 6 males, Oceanus, Cueus, Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, and Cronus, and 6 females, Theia, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys. But these weren't ordinary beings. Each Titan carried fundamental cosmic forces. Oceanus, for example, represented the great river circling the world. Hyperion, on the other hand, controlled the sun. Mnemosyne governed memory itself. So they weren't just regular giants, they were geological processes with a body. And these forces made them so powerful that even their father, Uranus, feared them. So Uranus imprisoned them deep within Gaia's body, inside the earth itself. Until one day, Gaia had enough. She gave Cronus, the youngest Titan, an adamantine sickle. When Uranus came to lie with Gaia, Cronus castrated his father and seized control of the cosmos. And so, the rule of the Titans began, up until Cronus's own son Zeus overthrew them in a 10-year war called the Titanomachy. Now, what did the Titans look like? For starters, the Titans stood between 15 and 30 feet tall, dwarfing even the Nephilim. But their height was the least impressive thing about them, because the Titans' bodies weren't entirely flesh. Their bones had mineral-infused density that made them almost indestructible. Ancient accounts describe their skin with a rocky texture, with some Titans having marble-looking skin. And for the icing on the cake, their powers matched their appearance. The Titans could manipulate natural disasters. Cronus could trigger earthquakes by stomping. Hyperion controlled solar flares and droughts. Even Oceanus commanded tsunamis and tidal waves. It was obvious that if they wanted, they could reshape the landscape itself. And worst of all, they were immortal. Not in the sense that they couldn't be killed, no, but because conventional weapons were useless. There's no way one can stab a being whose bones were harder than steel, or strangle something that didn't need to breathe. So how were they defeated then? Before we talk about that, is there any proof that beings like this existed? Let's start with the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Tiryns in Greece. Massive limestone boulders, some weighing several tons, fit a little too perfectly without mortar. The ancient Greeks themselves believed that only Cyclopes or Titans could have moved such stones. Greek traveler and geographer Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, described the walls of Tiryns. Each stone is so big that a pair of mules could not move the smallest from its place. Then there's Mount Othrys itself. This is a mountain in central Greece where, according to Hesiod, the Titans made their stand during the Titanomachy. Throughout the range, archaeological surveys have found unusual geological anomalies, mineral deposits that don't match the surrounding formations. What if this was a clear work of the Titans? But as much as the Titans embodied raw, natural power, they were no match for Zeus and the Olympian gods. Since conventional weapons could not harm the Titans, Zeus defeated them with weapons forged by the Cyclopes, in addition to his lightning that could shatter even Titan bones. After the devastating 10-year war called the Titanomachy, Zeus hurled the Titans into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, said to be far beneath even Hades. But not all Titans suffered this sordid fate. Some Titans, like Prometheus and Oceanus, sided with Zeus and were spared. But Cronus and the others who fought, they remain imprisoned to this day. Or so the texts say. Because if the Titans could trigger earthquakes and volcanoes, what happens when they struggle against their chains? Gigantes, the Earth-born warriors. But the story of Titans does not end with that war. When Cronus castrated his father Uranus, the blood didn't just disappear into thin air, it splattered onto the earth, and from those drops of divine blood, another horrific giant race was born. The Gigantes. Unlike the Titans who came from the union of earth and sky, the Gigantes were born from blood and rage. When Uranus's blood hit Gaia's soil, she absorbed it, and over time, she gave birth to 100 monstrous giants. These weren't her Titan children. These were something else entirely. War incarnates, you can say. Gaia created them for one purpose: to destroy the Olympian gods who had imprisoned her Titan children in Tartarus. So the Gigantes were born with hatred already in their blood. The Gigantes stood between 20 and 40 feet tall, making them even larger than most Nephilim. But you know the most interesting thing about their physique. Below the waist, they didn't have human legs. Instead, they had serpents. Also, their upper bodies were humanoid but grotesque. Wild hair flowed down their backs, and thick beards covered their faces. What's more, the Gigantes possessed strength that surpassed even the Titans, so the gods couldn't kill them. Not by themselves, at least. According to an ancient Greek prophecy, the only way they could be defeated was if the gods worked side by side with a mortal. Soon, the time to fulfill their purpose came. It was time to wage war against the Olympian gods. Led by Porphyrion and Alcyoneus, the 100 giants marched on Mount Olympus, attacked with such ferocity that the gods actually feared defeat. This was the Gigantomachy, the war that nearly ended the Olympian reign. In no time, the gods were losing the battle until they remembered the prophecy. So Zeus recruited Heracles, the strongest mortal hero who ever lived. And with Heracles fighting alongside them, the tide turned. The battle was brutal. But eventually, all 100 Gigantes were destroyed, and their bodies buried under mountains and islands. To this day, when volcanoes erupt, some say it's the Gigantes still struggling against their prisons. Cyclops, the master craftsman. However, not all giants were warriors. Some were creators. While the Gigantes raged against the gods and the Titans shook the earth with their fury, 3 brothers worked in silence beneath Mount Etna. Their names were Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, and these ones weren't born to destroy. They were made to build, and they were called the Cyclopes. Born to Gaia and Uranus, the Cyclopes were siblings of the Titans. But where the Titans represented raw cosmic forces, the Cyclops embodied something different: craftsmanship. Brontes meant thunder, Steropes meant lightning, while Arges meant brightness. Each name stood for the weapons they would later forge. Like their Titan siblings, Uranus feared their power and imprisoned them in Tartarus. When Cronus overthrew Uranus, he freed the Cyclopes briefly before betraying them and throwing them back into the pit. They remained there for ages until Zeus freed them during the Titanomachy. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged the weapons that would help Zeus win the war. The Cyclopes stood between 12 and 20 feet tall, shorter than many other giant races. But what set them apart wasn't their height. It was their single, enormous eye positioned in the center of their foreheads, helping them see as deep as molecules. Their hands were also massive, built for precision work despite their size. However, the Cyclopes were more than. They were Zeus's supernatural engineers who created Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, and even Hades' helm of darkness. Think about that. This giant race was gifted enough to channel divine energy through physical material. This is what made them distinct. As evidence of their building prowess, the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae and Tiryns still stand today. Ancient Greeks couldn't explain how humans could have built them, so they attributed the construction to the Cyclopes. Then there's a fascinating archaeological connection. Ancient forge sites throughout Greece have yielded oversized tools, hammers and tongs that seem designed for hands much larger than human. Strange, right? But there is an even stranger story to the Cyclopes: how they were erased. Long after the Titanomachy ended, the Cyclopes continued serving as divine blacksmiths, creating weapons and tools for gods and heroes alike. Then tragedy came knocking. Apollo's son Asclepius, a gifted healer, became so skilled that he could raise the dead. Zeus saw this as a threat to the natural order and struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt. Enraged over his son's fate, Apollo couldn't attack Zeus directly. So he killed the Cyclopes who made the thunderbolt. According to some accounts, all 3 Cyclopes died. According to others, Zeus resurrected them because the gods still needed their craftsmanship. Either way, their role as master craftsmen ensured their legend lived on. Anunnaki, the extraterrestrial giants. Moving on, we cross into territory that mainstream science refuses to touch. According to ancient Sumerian texts, not all giant types were born on Earth. Some came from the sky. And they didn't just visit Earth, they created humans. We are talking about the Anunnaki. The Sumerians were the first civilization to develop writing. Around 3500 BCE, they began recording everything on clay tablets in cuneiform script. And among those records were detailed accounts of the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki itself means those who from the heavens came to Earth. And according to author Zecharia Sitchin, who translated Sumerian texts in the 1970s, the Anunnaki came from an undiscovered planet called Nibiru. Nibiru was a massive world with an elliptical orbit that brings it into our solar system every 3,600 years. When this planet's atmosphere began to falter, they came to Earth searching for gold to repair it. And this happened roughly 450,000 years ago. For their looks, the Anunnaki stood between 8 and 12 feet tall. Shorter than the Nephilim, yes, but still massive compared to humans. But above all, it was their skulls that raised discussion. From ancient Mesopotamia, cylinder seals consistently showed tall beings with elongated cranial proportions standing next to normal humans. In addition, archaeological discoveries throughout Iraq and Iran have uncovered actual skulls matching these descriptions. Skulls that are clearly not human. To top this, their lifespan was unbeatable. While Sitchin described the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial, the ancient Sumerian king list records them as rulers who reigned for thousands of years. 8 kings reigned for a combined total of 241,200 years before the Great Flood. It's either the Sumerians were terrible at math, or these beings experienced time differently than we do. One more thing about this giant type: they were far from primitive. Instead, they brought technology that made our modern achievements look like children's toys. From flying vehicles to building mines in present-day Iraq and Iran, they were unrivaled. So unrivaled that scholars like Sitchin credited them with the creation of humans through genetic engineering. Unbelievable. But you know what's harder to believe? It's how such a race was chased away from Earth by the Great Flood. When rivalry began to brew between the Anunnaki gods, it took a flood to end things once and for all. Jotnar, the frost giants. However, the story of giants did not end with the Anunnaki. Halfway across the world, in the frozen north, another race of giants never left at all. The Vikings didn't worship these beings. They feared them. And according to prophecy, this giant race is waiting in the ice for the day the world ends. Meet the Jotnar. Before there was an earth, there was only a place the Norse called Ginnungagap, a void so vast and cold that nothing could exist within it. But when the fire of Muspelheim met the ice of Niflheim, something impossible happened. From those first drops of melted ice, a being formed. His name was Ymir, and he was colossal beyond imagination. According to ancient Norse texts, while Ymir slept, more giants emerged from the sweat under his arms. These were the first Jotnar, older than the gods themselves. When the ruler of the Norse pantheon, Odin, and his brothers killed Ymir, they used his corpse to build the world. And so, his flesh became earth, his blood formed oceans, his bones became mountains, and his skull became the sky. Sounds like folklore, but this is what the ancient Norse believed, that everything exists because the gods murdered the first giant. As for their gigantic nature, the Jotnar ranged from 15 to 50 feet tall, but their abilities were even more mesmerizing. Without batting an eye, they controlled ice and winter itself, summoning blizzards and freezing armies at will. Many also practiced Cedar, powerful Norse magic allowing them to see the future and shapeshift. But unlike every other giant race, the Jotnar's story hasn't ended. According to their texts, parts of their story are yet to be revealed. At Ragnarok, they will march from Jotunheim in the final battle. The fire giant Surtur will set the world ablaze. Fenrir will devour Odin, and the serpent Jormungandr will kill Thor. Sounds like a lot, right? But the Vikings believed this future was inevitable, which means somewhere in the frozen north, the Jotnar are still preparing, still biding their time. Saitikar, the red-haired giants. But not all giants lived in the ancient world. In 1911, miners digging for bat guano in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, made a discovery that would confirm a Native American story that had been told for generations. They found red hair, giant skulls, and evidence of a massacre. It goes way back to the Paiute tribe, as they had been warning people about this for centuries. Long before white settlers arrived, their ancestors fought a war against a race they called the Saitikar. The name Saitikar literally means tule eaters. Named after the fibrous water plant these giants wove into rafts to cross Lake Lahontan. In her 1882 book, Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims, the daughter of a Paiute chief named Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins documented the story. She described this giant race as vicious, cannibalistic barbarians who stood between 8 and 11 feet tall, with distinctive red hair and pale skin. Unusual for the region. They weren't peaceful neighbors at all. The Saitikar raided Paiute settlements, captured prisoners, and ate them. For generations, this terror continued until finally, all the neighboring tribes united against the common enemy. In the heat of battle, the last of the Saitikar fled to a cave seeking refuge. The Paiutes demanded they come out and fight. When the giants refused, the tribes piled brush at the cave entrance and set it ablaze. Those who tried to escape through the smoke were killed with arrows, while the rest burned alive inside. When miners excavated Lovelock Cave in 1911, they found exactly what the legend described. Beneath 4 feet of guano lay thousands of artifacts and human remains. Miner James Hart reported finding a mummified body measuring 6 feet 6 inches tall with distinctly red hair. Other reports mentioned even larger remains, though many were destroyed by careless mining operations before archaeologists arrived. Giant sandals measuring over 15 inches were recovered, and there were also handprints in the cave walls that were far larger than those of normal humans. This was just the Site Ka saying, "We were once here." Quinametzin, the Mexican giants. The next giant race wasn't just found in the Old World. When Spanish conquerors arrived in Mexico in the 1500s, they heard the same stories from the Aztecs that missionaries had heard in the Middle East. Stories about giants who walked the earth in ancient times, giants who built cities, giants who were destroyed by the gods. These giants were none other than the Quinametzin. According to Aztec cosmology, the world has been created and destroyed 4 times. Each era is called a sun, and each is ruled by different gods and populated by different beings. The Quinametzin lived during the 4th sun, known as the Sun of Water, and they were the original inhabitants of what would become Mexico and Central America. Now, the Quinametzin were no ordinary humans. They stood over 10 feet tall and weighed around 600 pounds. They possessed superhuman strength that allowed them to move massive stones and construct monuments that still baffle engineers today. But just like the Nephilim, they had a fatal flaw. They didn't reverence the gods. Instead, they attempted to reach the heavens with their buildings. And for this sin of pride, they were punished. The gods sent a catastrophic flood that wiped out the Quinametzin civilization. Only 7 giants survived by hiding in caves. The most famous of these survivors was Zelwa, also known as the Architect. When Zelwa emerged after the flood, he had a mission: to build a pyramid so massive it could serve as a refuge from future floods, a structure that would reach the sky itself. So he built the Great Pyramid of Cholula, the largest pyramid on Earth. This pyramid boasts a base 4 times larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza and almost double the volume. It measures 1,480 feet wide and 216 feet high. Most of it is hidden under what appears to be a natural mountain, but it's entirely man-made. Like its second name, Tlachihualtepetl, which means made by hand mountain. How incredible is that? According to legend, Zelwa organized a human workforce in a continuous line from brickmaking sites to the construction area. Bricks were passed hand to hand in an assembly line that stretched for miles. The Aztecs also credited the Quinametzin with building Teotihuacan, the mysterious city of the gods. Even the Aztecs didn't know who originally built it. They found it abandoned and believed only giants could have constructed something so massive. As proof of their prowess, Spanish chronicles from the 16th century documented the legends extensively. Friar Diego Duran wrote that he personally saw enormous bones being extracted from the ground in Puebla. Friar Bernardino de Sahagún also stated that the builders of Teotihuacan and Cholula were gigantic beings. During the siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521, Spanish forces encountered a warrior named Tzilacatzin, who stood over 10 feet tall. He defended Tlatelolco by hurling rocks the size of watermelons at Spanish soldiers. Eyewitness accounts described him as a giant whose bravery inspired defenders for days. Now we know that the 4th sun ended in a great flood. The Quinametzin who didn't hide in caves were drowned or transformed into fish. But what happened to survivors like Zelwa? According to ancient texts, they completed their building projects before disappearing from history. Some accounts even say that 4 Quinametzin giants were transformed into pillars that hold up the sky in the current age. As for Zelwa, when he tried to build the Cholula pyramid to reach the heavens, the god Tonacatecutli rained fire from the sky, ending many workers and halting construction. The giants faded into legend, leaving behind only their impossible structures as proof they were ever here. These are the 11 giant types that contended for supremacy before they were wiped out. Which giant race intrigued you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.